Hiyo Gamers. I've noticed a lot of people are surprisingly unaware on how transformative reactions work, even after years of Genshin being out, and that's okay. I'm mostly targeting people who don't know much about electrocharged and overloaded reactions. But in this video, I want to talk primarily about those two, but also on the others that make up this category of transformative reactions. We will have a whole new set of reactions coming with Dendro, and they will most likely be transformative reactions, so it's best to understand this whole category now without getting overwhelmed, then Dendro reactions will be easier to understand. And then hopefully, they'll use the same knowledge so you won't have to think too hard about it. And you bet I'm going to make a Dendro reactions guide video as well, just in case if I need to teach you something new, you know I got you. But so do 50 other content creators, so I'll do my best. But in terms of the existing transformative reactions, what I end up seeing is people make these teams, but then use the wrong rotations, build the wrong builds, and lose damage because they don't understand these reactions as a whole. And that's okay. That's what I'm going to be here for, showing you what needs to be happening in order to understand the path to transformative reactions. For those of you who need it, but maybe you'll find something interesting in this little tips and guide portion of the video too. Oh, and also no crazy math. I don't even talk about ICD in this video, just know that ICD has a regular cooldown of about like 2 seconds or so. This is just on the top of my head, so if you want to go learn more about ICD, check out either Genshin Wiki, Kaching Mains, or any other resource that has a good description of ICD. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk to you about 1 + 1 = 2. And that goes for all the things I'm going to be talking about in this video, so be sure to check out those resources if you want more. I'm a certified tutor, so I'd actually be really disappointed in myself if I ended up not teaching this topic correctly and giving you the proper resources you need. My god. Anyway, let's get started. Hello there, I'm Leo, Oddster, but you can call me Mr. Elemency, your tutor and guide for elemental reactions in Genshin Impact. Now let's just use our lovely helper Masanori as our big buff test dummy. Don't worry Masanori, you're not just dumb, Before we begin, I just want to share a basic fact about transformative reactions. Some of you may know this, but that's okay, I'm here to reiterate it. Transformative reactions have a much higher scaling value based on elemental mastery. The damage is also based on the character's level, but they do not factor any stats like attack of the character. The great thing about EM builds is that it doesn't require attack, and you can just simply use EM pieces as the main stat from either weapons to artifacts. And the best part is that these reactions ignore enemy defenses. All of them do. But they also take elemental resistances into account, so you can remove resistances and deal more damage. But I'll get into that later. These reactions also do not crit, which means it can sometimes be a wasted potential to make mixed builds for your Swirl-based characters, but do your best to stack as much elemental mastery as possible for elemental mastery-focused characters. For DPS characters, elemental mastery is simply just a bonus, but it can be a fun build option for other options for your characters. Alright, let's get into it, shall we? I'm going to skip Superconduct because it is not known for its damage. It is the base damage for all transformative reactions, being the lowest. It is known, though, for its debuffing and very straightforward in its use for physical-based teams. So, we will move on, and we will actually start with a Shatter reaction first, because it is the most niche, but it is quite straightforward, though there might be some facts that you might not know about it, and it will start a standard for all the reactions that go after it, with certain lessons that I will teach you. The Shatter reaction is when Cryo and Hydro make freeze, but then a heavy attack from anything like a Claymore to Geo attacks, when hitting a fully frozen target, shatters them. This creates the Shatter physical damage reaction to occur, dealing physical damage, but it is triggered by that of a Geo or Claymore character. Yes, plunge attacks can also trigger it, but let's set aside plunge attacks for now because it'll get too confusing. Look at this big silly man getting shattered. Since in this case, Geo or Claymore attacks trigger the Shatter. The characters that trigger are the ones dealing the damage. So this means that the value here in the Elemental Mastery description says that the Shatter amplification is by this amount by the last character that triggers the reaction. This is very, very, very important for later, okay? This is the LCTR acronym. Write this down in your notebook, please. The last character triggering Shatter is the one whose Elemental Mastery scales its damage, dealing the most damage overall. Not the Hydro character, not the Cryo character, the triggering character, who is a Claymore or Geo character. Straightforward, right? Sadly, though, it seems Shatter is vastly underrepresented in general, only really being a bonus damage. Shatter has its own issues, but it is very easy to understand, and it's a great way to set our standard forward. So let's move on. The next is Swirl. Swirl is the easiest reaction to perform and understand, but there are some things you might not know about Swirl, so be sure to pay attention, class. What am I going to keep this? How far am I going to keep this up? Swirl is when an Anemo character deals Anemo damage to an enemy with an elemental application aura. This causes the element to swirl and be triggered by the Anemo character. This is easy to understand because we all know why Anemo characters who can swirl are so incredibly powerful. The Anemo character is the one who amplifies their damage with elemental mastery. Because they are what? The last character that triggers the reactions. Good. Are you getting it? See how this can help us with later reactions? Don't think too far ahead though, we're still on Swirl, so keep that in your back pockets. God, I'm really sounding like a teacher. I'm a tutor! And now, some neat fun facts about Swirl. Did you know that Swirl only removes a portion of an elemental application, and Anemo characters have certain values that remove less or more of that element under certain conditions? So that I don't overwhelm you, I will only talk about Best Boy Kazuha. Kazuha removes only a small portion of Hydro on the enemy here with his elemental skill when you tap it, causing you to only boost Hydro damage, but not Pyro, that is absorbed from Bennett's elemental burst. However, when you hold his elemental skill, it will remove more of that elemental application. This allows Kazuha to swirl multiple elements at once, based on his priority of absorbing elements, which Pyro is at the very top for him. And now, if he wants to boost both elemental types, you hold his skill. See how that works there? It buffs both types of damage. Again, I won't get too much into this because it's supposed to be a quick little fact, but this is very helpful for Kazuha havers. One other fact you may definitely know is that Swirl can be multiplied by having multiple enemies with multiple elemental applications, causing multiple reaction swirls from all the characters swirled in a close area with each other. Though for some reason, Hydro is one of the only elements that only swirls once per enemy. The other elemental swirls don't do this. Very strange. Another fun fact, this time you might not know, is that Anemo characters can trigger multiple reactions with Swirl, and have their reaction damage scale with their own elemental mastery. See Kazuha triggering Overloaded? Interesting, huh? If you're really knowledgeable enough, you can set up an Electro charged and Overloaded team with Anemo characters being set up to deal the highest damage. Let me know if you want a dedicated video lesson about Anemo characters triggering these reactions. I wonder if this will be helpful for the future. I can't do this anymore. The final fun fact about Swirl is that of course it is not increased by any Anemo damage bonuses from any source. The type of damage that it actually is the swirl of the elemental aura application on the enemy that you swirled. But no elemental boosts of Hydro, Pyro, Electro, or Cryo can help boost this damage. Only elemental resistance shred from things like Viridescent Venerer and C6 Beidou and Zhongli Shield, just to name a few. And that's why Swirl is a very strong transformative reaction. Moving on now, we're gonna get to the juicy one, Overloaded. Now, I'm gonna go back to my professor self because this is gonna be on a pop quiz at the end of this section, so be sure to take notes if you haven't already. Now, to start, how does Overloaded deal its damage? It's Pyro and Electro, right? Who does the most damage in Overloaded? That's a trick question. Is it Pyro? Or is it Electro? It's the last character that triggered the reaction. That's right. Remember your LCTRs. I may not be in this professor voice, but this will be plenty important for putting your knowledge to the practice in this pop quiz that's at the end of this section. So with all that in mind, it's extremely easy, believe it or not, to control who is dealing the most damage with Overloaded. Luckily for you, it's any Pyro or Electro character you want. As long as you have the right team setups, it's the right kind of character, your rotations, and arming your character that you want with loads and loads of elemental reaction mastery. Okay. Even solely an elemental mastery build, and it's better that way for Overloaded anyway. What the hell was that? I had a stroke. To reiterate, Overloaded teams like a lot of elemental mastery. Anyway, before we get into the nitty-gritty, here are some fun facts about Overloaded. Did you know that Overloaded reaction damage is actually pyro damage? It's of course not boosted by pyro damage bonus, but it is indeed increased by shred of pyro resistance shred, which means enemy pyro resistance comes into account when dealing big damage. Viridescent Venerer wearers are the best for amplifying this kind of damage. I'm sure some of you know this, but did you know that Overloaded damage is currently the highest scaling damage for Transformative Reactions? So stacking Elemental Mastery, like I said, is perfect for those Overloaded teams. And our final fun fact is, did you know you can actually break most shields faster with Overloaded? Overloaded actually deals more damage to shields in general since it's an explosion. And I mean all shields, either rock or shields that are elementally aspected. Though sometimes, since the damage itself is pyro, it deals more damage to some shields than others, so be aware of that. Alright, now for Overloaded and how it functions. Pay attention. Let's say, for example, you want your Yanfei or Toma to trigger Overloaded because you stacked EM on them and gave them EM weapons. For this team, you have a couple options, but the answer is always visually clear. You want a faster Electro applicator than your Pyro character, so that your slower Pyro character triggers Overloaded with their application. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense, more Electro Pyro trigger character go boom damage elemental mastery on Pyro character only. For setups on how to perform this, you would either want 2 Electro characters, which is nice for energy generation with Electro Resonance, or you get a fast powerhouse of an Electro applicator who is off-field like Fischl. However, if you are using a unique off-field Pyro character like Toma or even Xiangling, you could even run a on-field applicator like Razor, Keqing, or even Yaimiko. Lisa can work too, but she doubles as an off-field applicator. This allows for your Electro characters to act as on-field applicators and drivers for, in this case, Toma's Pyro Burst to activate and trigger Overloaded. This allows a lot of flexibility in team compositions, so pay attention to how these teams are set up. And pay attention to what characters may or may not work with certain setups, like maybe Xiangling is too quick of a Pyro applicator, so she would need to set up an Electro character, and so on. As you can see, there are many options for Pyro triggering characters. As for Electro triggering characters, it's exactly the same. All you need to do is mirror it, and remember, LCTR. The last character triggers reactions. LCTR. Yep, I'm hammering this into your head. Applying this logic, as long as you have enough of the opposite application, whether it be Pyro or Electro, you can get the triggering character that you want to reliably trigger Overloaded, as long as your team is built properly and you use the right rotations. What are the right rotations? Well, let me know in the comments if you want a part 2 for Overloaded and even Electrocharge rotations. Basically, it's just the same as I mentioned before, so go back if you need more study time. Anyway, what's interesting and unique about Electro characters triggering Overloaded is that there are more off-field Electro characters than on-field, which means you can use a Pyro main DPS who is an applicator for Pyro and lets your off-field Electro character trigger the Overloaded. This is why Shinobu is such a powerful character, because she heals, scales her healing off of Elemental Mastery, and deals massive elemental reaction damage like Overloaded and Electrocharged. Just be sure to use your Anemo character with 4-piece Viridescent to lower pyro resistance for that juicy overloaded boost. But be careful, because if you use Sucrose, Electro characters won't get that 50 elemental mastery from her passive, since it applies to the elemental character that she swirled. Oh, and if you're running an on-field Anemo character in your party, like Hazel or Sucrose, constant Anemo swirling will ruin the consistency on which Pyro or Electro character will trigger reactions. So, if you plan on doing that, run a mix of both Pyro and Electro characters with Elemental Mastery builds. It's actually quite effective, but it's inconsistent and less controlled. Also, the Anemo character could also stack Elemental Mastery to deal the reactions themselves. Remember how I mentioned earlier? That's how Swirl works. Now that I got you a little confused before our pop quiz, it's time for our pop quiz, in teacher fashion. What is the proper team setup for an Electro character triggering Overloaded and a Pyro character triggering Overloaded? Don't forget, who has the Elemental Mastery items as well? Give it to me in all details. Did you get it correct? If you said, Pyro character triggers need to have Elemental Mastery items and a team of high Electro application, on-field or off-field, with 2 or 1 Electro characters. And Electro triggers need the reverse, with them focusing on Elemental Mastery. The Pyro characters need to be high application with any combination of on-field, off-field, or having multiple of them. If you got this wrong, you can go back to study more. Just remember, LCTR. The last character triggers reactions. Just remember, the opposite element must apply the most application, and then the triggering character that you want needs to have less application and the most elemental mastery. Now, moving on to Electrocharged. Now, Electrocharged is a little tricky. It does follow the same format as I mentioned before, LCTR, but with a twist. Though I'm going to start with interesting facts first, because it'll clear up this reaction and show how interesting and different this reaction is, while being the same. Electrocharged is when Hydro and Electro are on the enemy. Pretty straightforward. The Electrocharged functions similarly to Swirl though, where the more enemies who have Electro and Hydro on the enemy, the more damage it deals to enemies in a packed area. Unlike Swirl though, Electrocharged does not, and I repeat, does not apply elements. I think I blew most of your minds here by saying that. Electrocharged does deal additional bits of damage to Hydro or Wet applied targets, but it does not apply Electro. This is definitely something that most people miss because the damage does trigger with Hydro or Wet applied targets, but it only deals damage. Now, did you know that Electrocharge counts as Electro damage, which of course could be shredded to boost its damage, meaning Electro resistance is taken into account, making characters like Beto with her C6 mega strong for these teams. And finally, Electrocharged on the enemy leaves both Hydro and Electro application auras. What you may not know about that is that they decay at the same rate, which means you can also easily control who deals the most damage in this way, but very uniquely, by waiting for the internal cooldown or ICD of this reaction, which can be a little annoying, but you can still guarantee that most of the damage will go to the certain character that you want to trigger. It's not always random BS, that's just only part of the time. Oh, and it can also slightly stagger and stun enemies to varying degrees, similar to how Overloaded does knockback. With all this in mind, finally, with both auras being applied, you can indeed cause Vaporize and Overloaded at the same time, while Electrocharged is reacting. However, did you know that the Electro reaction is triggered first in Overvape teams, removing the Electro from the Electrocharged enemy, and then if Hydro is still on the enemy, it can react with whatever else reacts with it, most likely Pyro in this case. That's how Overvape teams and reactions work. The more you know. Oh, and that's also why Electrocharge and Freeze are horribly synergistic and don't go well in teams. Unless you're my partner Alan and you just kill. But as I'm showing you this Overvape team, you can unfortunately ruin the potential Electro-based Overloaded, such as the nice 800 EM my Shinobu has, and as you can see, she's missing out on the overloaded damage because Hu Tao is vaporizing and overloading, so her much smaller 4,774 overloaded damage is what's overloading. Which, wow, that's actually a really cursed number if you think about what's superstitious in the East, which is very scary and fitting for Hu Tao. Okay, and now for a mini lesson on Electrocharge to cap us off. If you want your Electro character to trigger most of the Electrocharge damage, you give them all Elemental Mastery or some Elemental Mastery on them and have a high Hydro application. If you want your Hydro character to trigger Electrocharged, have a high Electro application and preferably 2 Electro characters. Sadly, 2 Hydro characters can be wasted in a team using Electro triggering characters, but that may change over time. Who knows? I think it's worth mentioning since Electrocharge is a very unique reaction with multiple damage ticks, it's hard to track who deals the most damage so long as you have Elemental Mastery on most of your Electrocharge team, so basically both your Hydro and Electro character. Having an EM Sans or an EM weapon is plenty for an Electrocharge team, one or the other or both. Sometimes the annoying ICD gets in the way for Electrocharged, but at least a lot of damage is going out, so that's why some EM is better than a lot for these teams, unfortunately. But if you want to maximize elemental reaction damage from Electrocharged and everything else I mentioned before, above all else, what's the magic phrase? TLCR. The last character triggers reactions. Thank you, and thank you for my tutor talk. I've been Leodster as your tutor for Elemency and Genshin Impact. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Like, subscribe, and share this video to those who may need it, and hit the bell for more guide videos, theory videos, rework fun videos, and more. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you later. Huh? What? Crystallize? Is that a new reaction? Is that a...